Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. This quarter, we have been studying from Old Testament wisdom books. We finished a couple of weeks ago our study from the book of Job, and now we are looking at Ecclesiastes. Attributed by most scholars, but not all, to Solomon, David's successor, David's son and successor on the throne of Israel. After looking at what really felt like the dark, negative first chapter of Ecclesiastes, we turn now to chapter 3. And our focal verses are verses 1 through 15 of chapter 3. When I first looked at these passages, these verses, my thought was twofold. One, this is, not that it's easy, but this is a well-known passage, the first 8 verses in particular, but they're summed up, like so much of what we have studied before, in really the first verse. And so, man, it's going to be hard to get, if it's summed up in the first verse, all of the time attributed to our Sunday school time filled in. But then when I began studying the passage itself, my next thought was, oh my, how am I going to get everything in the short time allotted to us? Well, let's delve in and see how we're going to accomplish that, if we get it done at all. It may mean we summarize some rather than spend a great deal of time or much time talking about the actual meaning of some of these verses, because some of them are very self-evident, and they are summed up by that first verse. The first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 are is a well-known passage that deals with the balanced, cyclical nature of life. And these verses say that there is a proper time, or the King James says there is a purpose for everything. And so let's read those first 8 verses. And as I say, get into the study of today's lesson. And I'm reading from the New International Version if you're trying to read along with me. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. That's a summation of the next 7 verses, which are also well familiar to most people, whether biblical people or otherwise. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. By the way, let me pause quickly and say, some of these couplets, there are 14, and they compare almost opposites. And some of them seem to be grouped together, like these first 2, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. Verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. In this passage, our teacher says that there's a time for every matter in life. He illustrates this by presenting these opposites, 14 pairs of contrasting activities, as examples of how life is comprised of various seasons or times. There are several concepts that seem somewhat straightforward in these first 8 verses, or verses 2 through 8 in particular. First, timing of our activities is important. Ecclesiastes 3:8 talks about a time for war and a time for peace, and it talks also, verse 3 talks about a time to kill. Well, killing someone is generally considered to be evil and a crime. But that can change during a time of war, when defending our country is considered a noble or brave act. Dancing may be appropriate during a time of celebration, but it would not be appropriate for most funerals. But our actions and the timing of our actions are important to God. Secondly, these times or these seasons in which certain pursuits are proper, they are appointed by God. His plan for life involves a variety of experiences and activities. For instance, in these verses, weeping may be a part of life, but life is not all weeping. It's balanced with laughter, but laughter has a place also. There's a time to build. So construction is good in its time, but also there is a time when things are to be torn down, when that becomes necessary. And so perhaps a key to these first 8 verses, may be found in Ecclesiastes 3:11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. The proper activity at the proper time brings about God's purposes, and that's beautiful as a part of God's overall plan. A third concept. These verses serve as a bridge between the first 2 chapters and the section that follows after it. We are to accept each day as a gift from the hand of God. Why? Well, these 8 verses explain it is because God has a reason and a time for all things. We may be ignorant of God's timing, and we'll maybe even look at that in verses 9, 10, and 11. But we are called to enjoy life in the present time and trust then in God's sovereignty. The last 2 verses of our study this morning, verses 14 and 15. So God has offered through the inspired word from Solomon, and I think Solomon is the writer, that there is a time for everything and a season or a purpose for every activity under the heavens. Verse 1. Remember, under the heavens, remember from last week's lesson, under the heavens may mean the same thing as under the sun. It means short of heaven, our life. And so when it says under the heavens, it's talking about during our lives. God is sovereign. Our activity in this world is meaningful if we rely on His wisdom, His timing, and His goodness. So, season, as we've talked about, a time. There is a time, a season for everything and for every activity or event. Birth or death. Rather obvious. We give birth to a child, and it is a time of happiness, of enjoyment, of anticipation, of planning. But just as there is a time for birth, there is a time for death. It happens to all. The Bible says it is appointed once for man to die. And just as there's time for birth, there's a time for dying. It happens to all of us. It's appointed for a man once to die. Death isn't the way that God originally created things. He didn't make things to die. It's an enemy, and it is the result of sin. But nevertheless, even this sad, sometimes ugly process has a place in life under heaven. Planting and uprooting, which is somewhat related to being born and dying, is also a natural part of life. We anticipate, or we know and realize, some of you, that those are connected. Some of you may be gardeners, and so you plant, and you then when it comes time to harvest, you do so. And then when it comes time to clean up and to prepare for next year's planting, you may uproot. There is a time for this. There is a time to kill and a time to heal. One commentary that I read suggested that this is connected to from an agricultural sense, connected to the previous verses about a time to plant and a time to uproot. And if so, agriculturally speaking, the animals raised on the farm are often raised for the purpose of meat. And so it comes a time when that cow or goat or chicken is to be killed so that food can be provided for the table. But if that cow were to get sick, even though the ultimate plan is that it's going to be killed, if it gets sick, there's a time for healing, for treating, to try to make it well. I'm not sure that that's the proper interpretation of that little couplet, a time to kill and a time to heal. I think it's more related to the 8th verse, a time for war and a time for peace. War happens. Most would oppose any kind of war. But sometimes we aren't in control of that which causes war. And sometimes war, there is a time for it, and it must occur. But hopefully, there is a time for healing of that war, just as there is a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build, that's pretty obvious. Sometimes we need to build things. But sometimes that building lasts beyond its useful life, and it's appropriate to tear it down, often so you can build something else on top of it. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh. Again, rather obvious. There are times in our life when there is sadness. We don't usually laugh at a funeral or during a funeral. It is a sad time. It is a time that we appropriately express our grief through tears and weeping. And there are times for laughing. You do not, one commentary says, you do not expect to be weeping at a wedding. And I would quickly join in and say, yes, you might. If you're the parent of the bride and paying for all of those huge expenses, you may be weeping. If you, we say this with humor, if you commiserate with the poor groom who is about to take on a whole lot more than he can ever imagine, you might weep for him. But really and truly, there's a time for laughing and enjoying and celebrating, which goes with the next, a time to mourn and a time to dance. The weeping and the mourning, as in grieving, go together, as in a funeral, as at the illness of a friend that is possibly and likely going to lead to much suffering or death. There's time to mourn, but there is time to celebrate. The friend who has a bad medical diagnosis, but after much prayer and doctor's intervention, the word comes that that crisis has passed. It's a time for celebrating, for enjoying, for laughing, and maybe even for dancing. And then there's a strange one that's thrown in here in verse 5, a time to throw stones, or New International says to scatter stones, and a time to gather them. Most of the different commentaries that I read said nobody really knows exactly what Solomon is talking about here. Some even say this is a euphemism for sexual relations. But as another commentary said, I sure would like to know how they justify that idea as a proper interpretation, because this expression doesn't seem to apply anywhere else in the Bible to be talking about sexual relations. I can't ascribe to that belief either, but I wanted to mention it out there. It's also possibly a term used to discuss tactic in warfare. That is, to scatter or to cover somebody else's, the enemy's, fields with stones to make it sort of a revenge factor, or hard for them to produce crops. Seems also a bit far-fetched. Another interpretation is that children are throwing stones, and I envision them standing by a body of water and throwing stones and watching them skip across the water. Sort of a fun time. But to do that, you also have to gather the stones to do that. So there's a time for throwing stones and gathering stones. Otherwise, I'm not real sure how that might be used. Another suggestion was, in Israel in particular, the death penalty was carried out by stoning someone to death. Think of Stephen in the New Testament. There was a time, inappropriately, I think, when he was stoned. And they had to gather those stones first. Well, maybe it is or maybe it's not. Some suggest the sexual aspect or the sexual connotation or interpretation is because of the following statement. There is a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And they want to put a sexual connotation to that. I'm not sure that that's true, but I certainly know that there is a time to embrace and a time to no longer embrace, to refrain from it. I think immediately of when I took my daughter, two thoughts. One, to college. She went off to college, to Waco, to the Holy Lands. And we loaded all of her things into her dorm room and then had to leave her there. And then I had a similar experience when she went to Michigan for a summer, an internship. And I drove her up there and helped her unload her things that she was going to use for the summer, and left her the car. And she drove me to the airport so I could fly home. In both instances was a time to embrace and express how much I loved her and cared for her. But at the same time, it was not good for her, and frankly it wasn't good for me, to remain there. She did not need a daunting, clinging parent. She's ready to go on and live her life and start preparing to live her life. There was a time to embrace and to tell her I loved her, but there was a time to stop that, to refrain from it, and leave her so she could go on about making the rest of her life what she has made of it. Interesting. Maybe that's what the man Solomon is talking about. A time to search and a time to give up. I find those times to be more and more prevalent as I have a brother who says, I am not becoming forgetful. I just have a mind that all of the memory disks are full. And so when I don't remember things, I misplace something. I search forever. That's wrong. I search over and over the same places over and over, partly because I have found it after 3 attempts to search many different places in one of the places I've already searched. But there's also a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. My wife says, I understand the first one, and thus I say there is a biblical basis for my propensity to hoard, to keep things. It says right here, there is a time to keep. My wife wants to point out that it says also there is a time to throw away. If you haven't used it in the last 5 years, maybe it's a time to throw it away. And I say, well, I might lose some weight and I can get in those pants again, so I want to keep them. Anyway, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak. I think this is one of God's provisions that all of us should be aware of. You probably know somebody who understands the last part, a time to speak, because they never stop talking. Solomon says there's a time to be silent at all as well. We need to have the discernment to know the differences, a time to love and a time to hate. We have, to some extent, already talked about that. I just want to point out that God himself balances love and hate. Oh, you say? Well, God is love. That's a direct quote from the Bible. But we're also told that he hates certain things and even certain individuals. In the book of Revelations, Jesus tells us that he hated the deeds of certain groups of individuals. Yes, hate. God told us that he hated the individual Esau and loved the individual Jacob. But the point is that God is balanced. He loves the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son to die for your sins and my sins, that we might have eternal life in his presence. But he hates the evil in the world so much so that if you are a friend of the evil of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. And he goes on and compels his people, commands his people not to love the world, that is, the evil in it, just like he doesn't. God's love and hate is balanced, and it should be with his creatures as well. We've talked about war and peace, so let's try to move to the last part of today's study and look at verses 9 through 15. We'll read them as we go. Verse 9, what does the worker gain from his toil? Verse 10, I have seen the burden God has laid on men. It's a bit of a change here in these verses. In these 2 verses, men's work is revisited. Remember that he talked about this thing, work, the pursuit of pleasure, satisfaction, even when he was trying to pursue even when he was trying to pursue pleasure in chapter 1 and 2, just for satisfaction, he ended up working. So our teacher here, Solomon, is returning to the theme of work. What do workers gain from their toil? Sort of something he said in chapter 1. So we see him focusing again on work. In some ways, maybe these first 3 chapters seem to be Solomon's attempt to show us the vanity and the meaninglessness of work and labor if it's apart from God. So is he going to get negative? Like I said as we started today's lesson, chapter 1 seemed so negative. Is he going to get negative again? I thought we were past that and we were going to look positive, like those first 8 verses, some of the most beautiful poetry in the Bible. And remembering verse 11, as we alluded to a moment ago, let me read it. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So he is going to talk about the ultimate profit that a person can gain from work. And it may not be much, so it does almost sound like he's getting negative again. But he doesn't really do that. Instead, let's look at this next section where he says, verse 11, where he says, God made everything beautiful. That sounds very positive. And everything must also then include man's work. God has made man's work beautiful, or at least appropriate. He's made everything to fit beautifully in its own time. There is a time for everything. So God then has also put eternity in man's heart. We know there's more than what we know in our hearts, in our being, that there's more than what we've experienced thus far in our life. And that's eternity. But that's just now out of our reach. It's out there, but it's really beyond our ability to comprehend. And it's just dark enough, if you will, clouded enough that we can't find out the work that God has done from the beginning to the end. We know that these things happened before us, and we know that things will happen after we're gone. But what they will be, we don't know. But God knows, and that's what our teacher is trying to tell us here. He wants us to remember, God knows. And I think the idea is that if you want to know what God knows, you need to know God. You want to make sure that you're on His side. He's got work to do from eternity past to eternity future. And we want to be sure that we're a part of that work. Perhaps that's what the teacher is trying to say to us here. And so he again, having revisited the idea of man's work, he now admits that even work in its time is a beautiful thing, verse 11. But he adds, he has added the element of eternity that we should be mindful of. And in light of all of that, he asserts that man should enjoy his life and his work. Verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. In verse 13. That each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all of their work, all of their toil. This is the gift of God. So I think this is maybe Solomon's conclusion. Enjoy do your work, do good, eat, drink, and enjoy life. That is all we can do on this side of eternity, and we can only do that if God is a part of our life. And then in summation, in verses 14 and 15, summation of our lesson this morning, verses 14 and 15, it gets a bit deep again. I don't really have time to cover it all because I've run us out of time, but let's look at these two verses real quickly. I know that everything God does will endure forever, eternity. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Whatever is has already been. Deep. And what will be has been before. And God will call the past to account. So God's work is permanent. And contrast that with man's work. God's work lasts forever. Man's work at its best remains for just a while, and then is passed on to our descendants. It's given to others. But what God does lasts forever. God's work is complete and perfect. It's permanent and complete and perfect, so that we will be in awe of God. Wisdom is to fear the Lord. That is to be in awe of him. As the last part of our lesson, God's work is perpetual. In this section, we see that God's work is continuous and perpetual. What happened in the past is happening again now. And what will happen in the future already happened in the past, says our teacher. That is a way for us to seek to understand a little bit about God, is to recognize that he is permanent, he is perfect, and he is perpetual. He is eternity. And if we can fear him, be in awe of him, and recognize this about God, then we too can enjoy this life under the heavens, under the sun. Interesting and deep. Thank you for joining with us as we attempt to study from Ecclesiastes. We will continue in next week's lesson. Thank you and good morning.